Hi my loves, thanks for returning. As you know by the thumbnail, this video is going to be all on the Sephora Pro eyeshadow palettes and if they're worth having. So if you're interested, then just keep watching. So I just wanted to pop in here really fast and talk about the Sephora Pro eyeshadow palettes and if they're even worth having. I did a similar video a while ago on the Natasha Denona palettes, and I'll link it up above just in case you're interested. I really didn't go into swatches in that video, and during that video I talked a lot about if the palettes were worth your money, the formula, you know, things like that. So I think I'm going to stick to the same format with this video. As I talk about the palettes, I will swatch a few of the shades just so you can kind of get an idea of what they may look like swatched, even though we all know that swatches are not a direct indicator of how a eyeshadow will apply. I do have all of the palettes but one. I decided that the Editorial 2 palette was a little bit too light for my skin tone, and it reminded me a lot of the first Editorial palette, and since I've had that palette I really don't reach for it as much. And that's not to say that I think that it's a bad palette or anything. I just didn't want to spend $68 on something that I know for sure is going to sit in the back of my drawer. So with all that being said, let's get to the first palette. So I'm going to start off with the Sephora Pro Nude palette. It comes in the classic same box just like this, except this is pretty much a nude color. Just like with the previous palettes, you get the palette on the back of the box, you get the ingredients as well as a little blurb of what to expect from the palette. These palettes are made in the US, which I think is awesome. What I will tell you about this particular palette is that the ingredients is different from the first set of eyeshadow palettes from last year. And even though I was going to check the ingredients anyway, I decided to immediately check when my eyes started to run and I got the sniffles. So I'm thinking, okay, what's going on? Because the previous set of Pro palettes I did not have any type of reaction to. So that in itself was a bummer for me. So here are the shades. I think they're really pretty, and the look that I have on now I created with this palette. I think that really all skin tones can benefit from this palette. I think that you get a lot of value for your money because you can get daytime looks as well as evening looks. Let me go ahead and swatch a few for you. So here are a few of the shades swatched. Now what I can tell you from this formula in comparison to the previous formula is that this palette does not have as much fallout. It does have fallout, but not nearly as much. And I would suspect that that is the reason why they switched up the formula, because I'm sure they heard a lot of what people were saying about the palettes, and a lot of people hated that about the palette. It didn't bother me, but what does now bother me is that I can't use this palette without my nose running or my eyes watering or things like that. So if you're sensitive to a lot of shadows, you might want to exercise caution when using this particular palette. As far as this palette, I think that they blend really well. They layer very well. You don't get a lot of fallout. So with that being said, when I apply my shadows, I don't swirl my brush into the palette. I tap off the excess and I tap my shadow onto my lid and I blend out from there. So with that method, I did not get any fallout, and overall I really enjoyed using this palette. Again, what I hated was the reaction that I had when using this palette. Also, I meant to tell you that as with the previous palette, you do get a insert which gives you instructions on how to do different types of looks, which is very helpful for beginners or for someone who is just looking for some assistance on the type of eyeshadow look they want to complete. All right, so next here is the warm palette, and same with the Nudes palette, you do get the shades right here. You get the ingredients. This palette was made in the US as well. You get the same insert, which gives you instructions on how to complete different looks. The only difference is it doesn't have the little lady on the little cards to show you how the eye look looks. This has the exact same packaging, except Sephora is written in gold. And when you open it up, you do get a mirror. Now, one thing that I forgot to say about the Nudes palette is that the names are written on the palette, whereas the older palettes, you have the insert, so you just kind of have to keep the insert. So here are the shades in the warm eyeshadow palette. I think that these shades are beautiful. I think that you get a lot of value for your money because you can literally use this every day. If you're one who wears eyeshadow to work every day, even on the weekend to go out, you can definitely get a lot of evening looks with this. You don't have any outrageously sparkle or shimmery type of shadows in this palette. However, you really do have some nice metallics that look beautiful on the eye. This palette does have a lot of kick up. Let me repeat that. It has a lot of kick up. So when using this palette, I would recommend using a brush that is possibly one of your softer brushes. Don't use a stiff brush, and to tap off the excess. But that's never been anything to bother me. I had no problems with using this palette. It didn't cause my allergies to act up, and I really love it. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a few swatches from the warm tone palette. And there you have it, just some really pretty warm tone shades. So let me just put the Nudes palette up against the warm palette. And here is the nude palette right next to the warm palette. I know this is probably awkward display of the palettes, but these palettes are so heavy. But initially I thought that these palettes were a lot closer than they actually are. The Nudes palette appears to me to have a bit more cooler tones mixed in with it. Even though it is called the Nudes palette, it does have some cool tone colors thrown in the mix. So yeah, even though at a distance they do look like they could be the same, really they're not. So next I want to talk about the Sephora Pro Cool Tone palette, and believe it or not, this one is my most loved out of all of them. And believe it or not, I have used this one the most between the Cool, the Editorial, and the Warm palette. On the back of the palette you get the shades. Again, you get the ingredients. This palette again was made in the US. On the inside you get the same card which shows you how to complete different looks. The same sturdy packaging. Sephora is written in silver. You get a mirror as well as the little card with the names, and here are the shades. So as you can see, the Cool Tone palette does have some similar shades that were in the Nudes, and those shades would be the pinks and the purples. Now you probably can't tell it all that well, but there are some very, very pretty metallic shades in here. In my opinion, you can do a lot with this palette because you have different textures. You have toppers, again, metallics, and some shimmers. So let me go ahead and swatch a few for you. And there you have it. Those are a few swatches from the Cool Tone palette. All right, so next I have the Sephora Pro Smokey Jewels. Now, this is the palette that I was most excited for because it reminds me of the Born to Run palette. On the back of the packaging, you do have what shades are in the palette. This palette, again, was made in the US. You have the ingredients as well as a little blurb about the palette. And this Formula 2 is different from the first 3 that came out, and I had the same reaction with this palette, which is most unfortunate, at least for me. And you know, I don't mean to harp on it. There's so many brands out there that are making eyeshadows where you're not having an allergic reaction. Companies are putting better and better ingredients because they know that a lot of consumers are now looking at what's actually being put in the products that they put on their face, as well as how they are reacting to those products. But anyway, enough about that. Here is a insert. These are different types of looks that you can do with this palette. And here is the outside packaging. Now this is purple. It looks like it could be silver, but it's really a purple tone color. and you get the same weighted type of palette. You have a mirror and you get a little slip that protects the shadows, and here they are. These are to die for. They are so pretty. I don't know that all skin tones could get the most out of this palette, and I say that only because a lot of these shades are very deep. You only have a few, which would be this first row, that would probably come out not that deep, but it really wouldn't show up all that light on a lighter skin tone. I think that this palette could benefit someone of deeper skin tone the most. I also don't think that you could get a lot of value out of this palette if you worked in a conservative environment, because as you see, there's greens in here, there's blues, there's a burgundy, there's kind of like some light oranges. There's not a lot of neutral shades per se. There's a lot of pops of color in here, which probably wouldn't go over well in conservative environments, but all other type of work environments, I think that this would go really well. This to me would be a great evening type of palette, or a great after 5 type of palette. You don't really get any of those sparkly shimmery type of shades in this palette. There's a lot of metallics and a few toppers, and the reason that I would call them toppers is because of how light they apply. Some of these shades I did apply over the matte shadows, and it just kind of gave you a slight sparkly type of look. There isn't as much fallout in this palette as with the first 3, so that is something to be noted. Now, I'm not saying that there's not any fallout at all, it's just not as much. And if you're wondering how close it is to the Born to Run palette, let me just grab that one. So here are the two side by side. Of course, this one is the Born to Run, and this is the Smokey Jewels palette. Of course, there's more shades in the Sephora Pro palette, but the only thing that's really missing in the Born to Run palette is a few pops of blue. Outside of that, I think these palettes are so close. So if you have the Born to Run palette and you were kind of eyeballing this Sephora Jewels palette, you might not need both of them. So let me go ahead and swatch a few from this palette for you. So here you have it. A few of the shades swatched from this palette. I think that they are really pretty. I think that this type of palette is something that you would actually have to go into the store and swatch for yourself, so you can really see the vibrancy of the colors. But overall, I think that this palette is totally gorgeous. These are my type of colors. I like the deeper tones because they are great at smoking out an outer V, just kind of taking a day look into a nighttime look. And if you're on the hunt for that type of palette, I would definitely suggest checking this one out. And the last Sephora Pro palette that I want to talk about is the Editorial palette. This is the box that it comes in. Again, you get the colors on the back. This palette was made in the US. You have the ingredients. You get the same insert as well, which talks about how you can apply your shadows to get different types of looks. Sephora Pro is actually written in a metallic blue, and you get an insert with the names, and here are the shades. Now, I think that this palette is very pretty. Extremely pretty. It's great if you are into lots of colors, and if this is something that you are going to gravitate to. Since I didn't gravitate much to this palette, I elected not to keep the Editorial 2 palette because it's basically a lot of these colors, but more on the pastel side and more of, how can I say, it had a lot of sheer shadows. Some people would call them sheers, some people would call them toppers. I just felt as though that palette was not suited for me. But with that being said, as far as this palette, this one had a lot of fallout. It is very powdery, however, it is very pigmented. I didn't have any type of allergic reaction from this palette. This palette has metallics, it has shimmers, it has duochromes. It's a really fun palette. However, it's just not something that I gravitated much to. Let me go ahead and give you a few swatches. And here are a few of the shades swatched. So that is pretty much it. Those are my thoughts on the Sephora Pro palettes. Are they worth having? I would say if you have money to burn and you are a beauty enthusiast, I would say yes. But there are so many more eyeshadow palettes out there on the market that are just as good as the Sephora Pro palette. There are palettes out there where you can get colors that are the same, textures that are the same, finishes. The list goes on and on. I have two friends here on YouTube that do so many dupes on different types of palettes, and I've said their names before: Colorful Camille and Lily Living Life. If there's ever a palette that you're interested in that you would like duped, or you're trying to figure out if there's something out there that is very close to it, I would suggest going to one of their channels. I'll leave their links down below. But overall, I hope this video shed some light on the Sephora Pro palettes, and I hope that it was able to help you make a decision just in case you wanted to purchase any of those palettes or not. So with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in, and until my next video, smooches.